Good afternoon, and welcome to Reimagining American Democracy, Episode 2, The Vote. I'm Jeanne Meserve, coming to you from Washington. The title of this episode sums things up. What could be more fundamental to democracy than the concept that everyone should have a right to vote and every vote should be counted? And you might think that after the 2020 election, which saw a record turnout, this wouldn't be a problem. But what we've seen this year is a series of voting reform battles that are dividing our country along even more deep partisan lines. A number of Republican-led state legislatures are fighting for stronger election security, but people on the other side of the aisle say many of these measures amount to voter suppression, which will particularly impact people of color. Today, we are going to speak to elected officials and experts on both sides of the aisle about what comes next, where compromises might be found, and a discussion of what we all can do to try to ensure that voting in America remains free and accessible to all. This series was made possible by a cross-partisan group of nonprofits: Freedom House, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, the George W. Bush Institute, and Issue One. Before we begin, a word from event co-host Jill Savitt, who is president and CEO of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights.
Hello, and welcome to Episode 2 of Reimagining American Democracy. I'm Jill Savitt, the CEO of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Our museum and the programs and trainings we offer connect the U.S. civil rights movement to the ongoing struggle for human rights around the world today. On behalf of the center and our co-hosts, Freedom House, the George W. Bush Institute, and Issue One, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to tune in. In just a moment, we'll be addressing one of the most fundamental and critical aspects of any healthy democracy: the vote. We want to know, what will it take to ensure everyone has the opportunity to vote and to make their voice heard? And what will it take for everyone to feel they truly have a place in our democracy? We hope you'll join the conversation, and you can do so and make your voice heard with the hashtag Democracy Reimagined. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy.
And now for a conversation about the front lines and voting. We are joined by Michael Adams. He is the Secretary of State for Kentucky, and Shenna Bellows, who is the Secretary of State for Maine. Thank you both for joining us today. Following the 2020 election, there has been an unprecedented surge in efforts to reform, or some say restrict, voting rights. As Secretary of State, you are on the front lines of these conversations. You also are the gatekeepers for state election results and to encourage voting. So I'd like to talk about what each of you are doing. Secretary Adams, let me start with you. I know that your motto has been, in our elections, let's make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. How has that demonstrated itself in the state of Kentucky?
Well, that's a two-part motto we have in our office, and we're sincere about both parts of those. We want to assure people that we're not going to limit their franchise unnecessarily, but we're also going to make sure the election is secure. And I think if you ensure that both sides are protected, that you're fair-minded, that you have both of those goals simultaneously, people trust you. And I think the key here is to not do this in a partisan way. To not have a partisan bill written by Republicans or Democrats. You got to have something that's bipartisan from the get-go. That's what we did here in Kentucky last year. I worked with the Democratic governor. I'm a Republican. We worked together through our emergency powers to make sure the election was conducted appropriately. We expanded voting in many cases to ensure that we had social distancing. We expanded absentee voting, early voting, and that gave us a really successful election where we get people safe and a secure election as well. And then that really set the table for a bipartisan reform that we put through our legislature this year, the biggest reform we've had of our system in 130 years. And it passed almost unanimously.
And what specifically would this bill do?
Well, for the first time by statute, we now have early voting in Kentucky. When I took office at the beginning of last year, we had one day to vote, 6 to 6 on one day, and a very limited use of absentee balloting. Only 2% of our voters voted absentee. And we made everyone else show up on one day, on a Tuesday. and cut it off at 6 o'clock. And that's just not how people live their lives today. So we basically blew that up. But the way that we were able to do that is by building a bipartisan coalition. And our measure passed almost unanimously through both chambers of our legislature.
Well, people want to know how in the world you built a bipartisan coalition around an issue that is so divisive.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a really polarizing area of policy. But the key is to do both access and security simultaneously. You know, this is generalizing a bit, but Democrats tend to be focused on access, and sometimes they have a blind spot when it comes to security. And Republicans have the opposite problem. They're obsessed with security, but they have a blind spot on access. And you've seen the results of that in Georgia, Texas, Florida, but also Washington. When you have partisan election bills that aren't designed to be bipartisan, that don't have both parties at the table, and don't have election administrators like Secretary Bellows and me at the table at the get-go, then you have these sorts of problems. The way to do it right is the way that we've done it in Kentucky, which is to get everyone together and ensure access is expanded, but also make sure that you have security.
So some pundits say that this was able to get through in Kentucky because the state generally votes very reliably Republican, and because you have a small minority population. Given that fact, do you think that this kind of reform with bipartisan support could pass in other red states?
Well, I think it could pass. And I don't think the fact that we're seen as a red state really was a factor in making it easier to pass this. We're actually a lot more purple than people think we are. We have a Democratic governor who won by 1/3 of a percentage point. My race was close too. We split our tickets in Kentucky, and so that actually makes it, I think, easier to pass this on a bipartisan basis because both parties have skin in the game.
So what about a state like Texas, which is seeing an increase in left-leaning voters? Could something like this win support there?
I think so. And I'll tell you, I'm real frustrated as a Republican. There's no need to restrict access as long as you've got security accounted for. We expanded absentee voting, but we also used a portal to verify identity of voters. We also improved our signature verification process. Interesting point, early voting actually makes the elections more secure. That was the finding of a commission that I had, a bipartisan commission. They said that when you spread the vote out over a period of days, it's actually easier for law enforcement to monitor the election and ensure against any suppression or intimidation or fraud for that matter. And so most of these things, you know, there's a Democrat version of Election Day and a Republican version of Election Day. These things are really not ideological. How people vote, what methods they use. You know, here in Kentucky, we just went online with our driver's license renewal. That wasn't seen as ideological. This is just another government service.
Secretary Bellows, I'd love to have you weigh in on this question of reform, because as you know, it's seen as reform by Republicans, also seen as suppression by Democrats. And I'm wondering if you think that this is a communication problem or is it something more fundamental?
I loved what Secretary Adams said about the fact that voting should be nonpartisan and accessibility should be a bipartisan goal. Many of the measures that we have in place in Maine that has made us third in the country in voter participation started out as bipartisan measures. So early voting, no excuse absentee voting. Those have traditionally been supported by both parties. And that's why you have in a state like Maine, over 60% of our voters in the last election voted absentee. Same day voter registration is another reform that was put in place in Maine in 1973 by a Republican-controlled legislature sponsored by a Republican. And it's something that has endured over the decades. And I like to say that same-day voter registration, which allows people to register and vote on Election Day, benefits whichever party has the most momentum in that particular year. So in 2008, benefited Barack Obama, and in 2016, Donald Trump. And so I think that's a really important lesson to keep in mind. Here in Maine, we've also been advancing nonpartisan election reforms, online voter registration to improve voter convenience, to match how voters live their lives. Automatic voter registration at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles is something that we're working very hard to implement as well. I don't see those reforms as partisan.
Another thing Maine is doing is ranked choice voting. You, I understand, were the first Secretary of State to be elected that way. First of all, explain to those who aren't familiar with it what ranked choice voting is.
Ranked choice voting is a system where you rank all the candidates on the ballot. So whether there are 3 or 6 or more candidates, you rank your choices in order. We use that in Maine in all of our primary elections, and then we use it in the general election for federal offices, including for president. And we used it in my election for Secretary of State. It certainly increases voter choice because it really allows voters to choose, okay, my favorite candidate might be this person, but if they don't surface to the top, well, I like this person, almost as well. And in terms of civility, I will say in my race for secretary, I had many conversations where I said, well, if I'm not your first choice, I'd like to be your second. And it definitely decreased the sniping or attacks on one another.
But do voters find it confusing? It seems to me that it could be a little intimidated to be faced with a list of candidates like this and have to pick not just one, but several.
When we first rolled this out, we did a series of ice cream socials to educate the public about this. And, everyone knows what their favorite ice cream flavor is, but and has a second choice or a third choice. I think people are fairly savvy and can evaluate choices. And I think it's something, Americans are used to doing. And we have not found high levels of voter confusion or spoiled ballots as a result. It has, in fact, been a very successful system for us.
So what problem does it solve? Why do this?
So in Maine, we have a very independent tradition. We actually have an independent senator of whom we're very proud, Senator Angus King. But you will see in Maine many split tickets. You'll see Democrats and Republicans getting elected in the same year, in the same districts. And so what this allows is for people to really voice their choices. It prohibits the problem of spoiler candidates, where you might have a third party entering a race just to change the outcome between the two major parties. Instead, this really empowers independents, third party candidates, and true voter choice.
And are you also saying that it also decreases the level of partisanship?
I think that what we have seen in some races is that it has increased civility. That when candidates are vying for a second choice vote or a third choice vote, they don't want to alienate their opponent's voting blocks because they're trying to recruit the broadest possible coalition of support from the public.
Secretary Adams, is this something that Kentucky would ever consider, do you think?
Well, actually, there was a bill filed by a Republican state senator in our session this year. It never got to a vote, but there's a sense that we actually would have reelected our Republican governor in 2019 if we had had a ranked choice voting method. The Libertarian took 2%. They probably took some votes from him. So I will say this, probably not. And this is a great example of why the states should make election policy for themselves versus Washington telling us what to do. We're a diverse country. We should respect that diversity. The culture of Maine, the culture of Kentucky, they're different. The culture of Oregon or Colorado or California or Mississippi, they're all different. And you got to have an approach that fits your local culture. I think in Kentucky, this would be a pretty hard row to hoe. We have a lot of people who think the elections are being hacked, and they think that the machines are on the internet, which they're not. I just would be reluctant to see an approach taken with an algorithm involved. First, I've got to explain to our voters exactly how they work now with our new early voting, with our new portal for absentee. I think I have to be restrained in how much we reform our elections in a period of time. We just changed our rules for the first time in 130 years. So this would be, I think, maybe too daring a reform for us right now.
Secretary Bellows, just quickly, do you think that this is scalable, that ranked choice voting could possibly work in a national election?
I think at some point, I do think the states are the laboratory for democracy. I also think that the constitutional right to vote, especially in our federal elections, is preservative of all other constitutional rights. So I think the feds set a baseline. Help America Vote Act, for example, modernized our election systems. In Maine, we have a paper ballot. We don't have computer voting. But now we have a central voter registration system, which increases our security and guards against fraud. So I think the feds can assist us, for example, HR1 or S1, in setting forth a baseline of basic voter protections. And then the states become the laboratory for additional reforms.
So traditionally, secretaries of state have been the ones to determine the outcome of elections, but that is being challenged in some places. Georgia is one place where they're talking about shifting authority over election administration to the legislature. It also removes the Secretary of State from the state election board. Secretary Adams, what are the implications of this? Are you concerned?
Oh, as long as there's transparency in the process and someone to be held accountable for the results of that process, I don't know that it matters a whole lot. Here in Kentucky, I actually don't personally certify the totals. Certainly, I help produce those, and then they're given to an independent board, equal number of D's and R's, and then they certify those results. And we have just a fine election here with no concerns, really. So I don't think there's any one way it has to be done. What Georgia now looks like is more like what Kentucky's been like my entire term, and it's worked just fine.
Secretary Bellows, what about you? What do you feel about these trends? Do you feel that elections are becoming more politicized?
I have some concerns that some of the proposals that have originated in various states are originating from lies about the 2020 election. The 2020 election was secure, was fair. And I have concerns about seeing increasing threats to election officials and politicizing the process, as well as voter suppression measures that have taken place in some states.
So following up on that, in some places, people, particularly on the far right, who objected to the 2020 election returns, are running for Secretary of State. Does that bother you?
It certainly concerns me that those involved in propagating misinformation and disinformation that has led to so much voter fear or lack of confidence in some of the results, that some of those same individuals are seeking positions of authority. Traditionally, elections administration has been nonpartisan, bipartisan, and that has been really important. The checks and balances in our system of elections are crucial to the strength and health of our democracy.
Secretary Adams, I'd love to get your view on this too.
Yeah, I agree. There was an interesting article in Time magazine a couple of months ago about how QAnon believers are running for local offices, and they're kind of under the radar because there really isn't much coverage anymore, unfortunately, of local politics. You have a lot of newspapers that have gone belly up, local newspapers, and there's just not much scrutiny. And so they're running for and winning school board offices, mayorships, and so forth. And I think eventually this is going to come in at the statewide positions, statewide elected positions. And so that's a real concern I have. I want to make sure that qualified people run for these offices. There's a larger, this is beyond, of course, our subject today, but there's a larger concern out there about experts not being experts anymore. There's a populist wave of anti-elitism, and people who are qualified to run elections, like Secretary Bellows and myself, we have no more credibility than just some random person on the internet with a Twitter profile. And everyone acts like they're equals, but they're not. Certain people are qualified to do this for a living, and other people are not.
So are you worried about future elections and how free and fair they will be?
No, not necessarily, because there's checks and balances. Here in Kentucky, I don't decide who wins the elections. We've got a bipartisan board of elections. Every county has a bipartisan board of elections by law. Every single precinct has a bipartisan group of poll workers. And you've got checks and balances. So no unqualified person, no crazy person can ruin or steal an election. There's checks and balances. I can't speak to what other states have, but I think that they have similar mechanisms.
So when it comes to making it easier to vote, I'd like you both to weigh in here on whether you have a couple of words of advice for politicians of both parties. Secretary Adams, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, it's really important to get the look right. I think one of the biggest reasons we were successful in Kentucky in expanding voting and getting the voters to trust it. Let me give you some specifics. About this time a year ago, we had our primary election. The governor and I, asked voters to vote by absentee ballot. We didn't want to have crowding at the polls. When I arranged this with the governor, my approval rating took a real hit. 2 out of 3 Republicans disapproved of my performance. But then 60% of Republicans ended up voting by absentee ballot, because we made the case for why it was secure, why it was reliable, why it was a good idea, and why we were asking them to do that, and they listened. Similarly, Republicans were against early voting when I did that in the general election. Polling showed that as well, but we educated voters and they listened. The public, despite all the polarization, if someone is trusted and goes out there and makes a case, people will actually listen and in many cases go along. So we actually saw Republicans utilize the early voting. The counties that had the biggest turnout with early voting tended to be the Republican counties. So there was a real sea change in public opinion. So people will listen to new information and new facts if you just make a good case.
Secretary Bellows, quickly, advice for other politicians when it comes to creating access to voting.
I think I really appreciated what Secretary Adams said at the very beginning of the program. Let's look at accessibility in terms of how people live their lives. No excuse absentee voting, early voting, online voter registration. These are reforms that match the moment that we're in, and something that I hope that everyone looking at voting reforms will take into account.
And we'll have to leave it there. Secretary Adams and Secretary Bellows, thank you so much for joining us. We vote where we live, in our cities and towns, and it is there that the battles over voting legislation and democracy are playing out. We're going to talk now to the mayor of Birmingham, Alabama, Mayor Randall Woodfin. This is a city with a rich civil rights history. Mayor Woodfin, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for allowing me to be with you today.
So we all remember the images. They're indelible from 1963 of water hoses and dogs being turned on civil rights protesters. It was outrage over those images that led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So as someone who was born and raised in Birmingham, I'm wondering how that history has impacted you and your politics.
Oh, absolutely. So I will tell you, as a son of the city of Birmingham, it is not only an honor to serve as mayor, but to really understand the position of the seat that I hold of not only service, but making sure around laws and ordinances that I remember the history and where we came from as a community and a city, and to do the right thing amongst the people that I serve. And so related to that, Birmingham has a very rich history. On one hand, there was full resistance here of not standing for not changing things. And on the other hand, you had people like Fred Shuttlesworth, who invited Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to come to Birmingham to resist and fight for change. And eventually that change won out. And so as much as we have those images in our head, I think we need to remember that the good folks won here in Birmingham. And that is the blueprint I take with me every day that I walk into the mayor's office, because down the hall on the other end is where Eugene Bull-Connor sat, who was the public safety commissioner at the time, who unleashed those hoses and unleashed those dogs on Black citizens here in Birmingham, a city that is now 74% Black, the fourth Blackest city in America. So I carry that history with me, but at the same time, I acknowledge that victory was won.
You also have said that your first job as a bagger in the supermarket had a big influence on shaping you and your attitudes. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I was fortunate to live in a household that there were never less than 8 people, which meant sometimes there were more than 8 people that lived in my home. 4 generations. My great grandmother lived with me until she was 100 years of age. And my parents, they taught me the importance of work ethic. They taught me the importance of helping others, and they taught me the importance of giving back. And so with that, getting that first job at age 15, my first boss, Dale Smith, he trained me and he taught me, always take care of people, always understand the importance of customer service, and always put people first.
You mentioned that Birmingham is now, I think you said, the 4th Blackest city in America. Dr.
Right.
King once called it the most segregated city in the country. Is it still, or have issues of poverty and equity been addressed to some degree?
City of Birmingham is a city made up of 23 communities, 99 neighborhoods, and 73% of the city is Black. And there are still an overwhelming amount of equity issues that exist. Let me unpack that for a little for you and for your audience, for this audience. In one hand, Brookings did a study on Birmingham and quantified and qualified those inequities and those gaps. but they also lay out a blueprint for how Birmingham can solve them. Around education and literacy, our literacy rate is too high. And it's not just poverty, it's concentrated poverty. So what have I attempted to do over the last 3.5 years as mayor is get a laser-like focus on the exit plan for those who graduate from our high school. I created a Birmingham Promise program that allows our seniors who graduate to attend any state school, 2-year or 4-year, free tuition, no questions asked. In addition to that, our juniors and seniors can participate in an apprenticeship program, leave high school early, receive credit hours, and make $15 an hour a livable wage. And so here in Birmingham, we're doing our part in the mayor's office to create a livable wage for our youngest generation and provide tuition free so they don't have to go in any debt.
And are you seeing
that's
change?
a way?
Is it having an impact?
It is. I believe that is a fundamental way to fight poverty. This is our second class that are participating in this Birmingham Promise program, and well over 500 plus students will be able to attend state school tuition free. These are most of them are first generation college students, but for this program, they couldn't afford to actually attend college because it's cost prohibitive. And it's cost prohibitive because there's a lot of poverty that exists in the city. So we believe this is our way of actually fighting poverty, not only giving our young people hope, but a tangible opportunity to change their lives and change their family lives.
Majority Black cities like Birmingham have seen very high levels of voter turnout in recent elections. I'm sure that the candidacy of Barack Obama in past presidential elections had some effect on that. But what are the other reasons we're seeing those numbers go up?
I think the assault down in state houses, state legislators at state capitals, where it's a offensive front and it's blatant. They're not even trying to hide it. Creating and changing all these laws around voting opportunity. I think Black people across America, not just Birmingham, are saying 60 years ago, I mean, think about this. 60 years ago, the Freedom Riders rode throughout the Southeast promoting, putting their lives on the line, putting their lives at risk, buses getting burned, bricks getting thrown through windows, et cetera, to fight for voting rights for Black people. This was 60 years ago. So in my mother's lifetime, there are legislators in capitals across the Southeast and other parts of the nation trying to invert and go back to laws that suppress Black people and minorities from voting. It's not right. It's wrong. And I think Black people across the country see that. And I think they're motivated to go vote, to make sure we have people at the federal level, especially, to create the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to make sure Black people's right to vote is protected.
Well, in Alabama, the state legislature has passed 2 laws, I understand, that will affect voting. One is a ban on curbside voting. The other changes the process for change of address. How concerned are you about the legal changes in your state?
I'm concerned enough to tell other elected officials in Birmingham, our state legislators who represent the Jefferson County delegation, who represent us down in Montgomery, we should be organizing. You know, the next statewide election primary is June of next year. The next statewide elections and midterms for everybody else is November of 22. We should be organizing now, a year out from the primary, to make sure residents in Birmingham, seniors in Birmingham, and elders in Birmingham, and those who just turned 18 in Birmingham, that we are creating a platform that however they need to participate, they have the opportunity to vote. That's now, that work starts now, a year out. It doesn't start, 30 days from the election of next year.
And has it started? Has your message gotten through to people?
It has. So Birmingham, like many other cities across the nation, just celebrated Juneteenth this past Saturday. And Black Voters Matter, they actually did a bus tour from Jackson, Mississippi to Birmingham Saturday, and just promoting, the importance of voting rights for Black Americans. And this fight is not over. 60 years later, but this fight is not over. And how does this fight look in 2021? How does this fight look in 22? How are we organizing ourselves? How are we holding our elected officials accountable? And if we can't get the support we need down in Montgomery and other state capitals across the Southeast, the opportunity for the president, Joe Biden, the opportunity for at least right now, the majority of Congress, act now, pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act now, protect people's right to vote. The action is needed right now. Now's the time.
What do you say to those people in Alabama and in other states who are enacting these laws, who say this isn't about voter suppression? What this is about is improving security around elections to actually increase confidence in democracy?
Shame on you. That's what I would say. Democracy won November of 2020. How can there be voter fraud? All right. And what I mean by that, let's unpack this. The same president who was a Democrat who won down in these state capitals for the state elections on the same ballot that the president was on, Republicans won. So how can it be voter fraud at the presidential level, but no voter fraud at the state level, but the same ballot? So let's be very clear about what this is. This is not about protecting people from trying to steal a vote or people doing unlawful things. You have winners and you have losers. And you've had some losers at the federal level who are now trying to change the laws to keep people from voting. And that is what this is about. It's nothing more. At least be straight up. At least be honest. Don't try to pull one over on people because we're not dumb, we're not stupid.
So you see this as voter suppression?
100%. Think about this. Voting is a bedrock and foundation of this nation. And for a long time, for way too many years, Black people were not even a full person. For a long time, we were property. For a long time, we were slaves. And then after that, we weren't even allowed to vote. And look how many years that took. Then you have this Fifth Amendment in the clause of the Voting Rights Act that was snatched and pulled away. And so you have legislators now creating laws to suppress the vote. When you got other states like Washington, it's automatic when you turn a certain age. Your voting is sent to you in the mail. I mean, this is 2021. Everything else is done in such an efficient way. Why are we making it hard for Americans to vote in 2021? It shouldn't be. It's not right. It's wrong. It's immoral. And we need to stand up against those who are enacting these laws.
Birmingham has started an initiative called the Academy for Civic Engagement. Tell us what that is and what the goal is.
It's quite simple. The last class just kicked off last week, and this is the fourth class. And what I have shared with these citizens, they're everyday citizens. Democracy is a participatory sport. It was never meant for you to elect your mayor, elect your city council, put the 10 of us in a boat and think everything is going to just change or be solved overnight. That where you live, on your block, on your street, in your neighborhood, we need our citizens to participate in local municipal government. And with that stated, most people don't know how their local government works for them. They don't know how 311 works if you have an issue such as pothole or your trash. They don't know how 911 works or, community development or economic development or how the budget is formed, et cetera. So the Academy of Civic Engagement, better known as ACE, is for our everyday citizens to know and learn how their local government works. So it's basically a leadership class, but for them, they get to see City Hall, visit City Hall, engage department heads, and it peels back all the layers of this is how your government works at a high level and at all the other levels for any departments, actually all departments related to how municipal government works.
Are you hoping that it has another effect, that it clues people into the importance of government, into the importance of voting?
Absolutely. This democracy, right? It's You're not supposed to vote for your elected officials and then just sit on the sideline every 2 and 4 years and come back and vote. What we need is active citizens engaging us, holding us accountable, knowing what we're passing, advocating on their own behalves. So with that, I think this program is definitely geared towards making sure our citizens are not only informed, but they know how their government works. And then they can be better advocates about the issues they're concerned about and hold us accountable as elected officials.
Birmingham Mayor Randall Woodfin, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation.
Thank you.
We are at an inflection point in American democracy. Although there was record turnout in the 2020 election, only 67% of voting age Americans showed up at the ballot box. Why? Many feel that their votes aren't counted, or their voices aren't heard, or their issues aren't being considered. How can we change that? How can we bring more people into the democratic process so their votes and voices are considered? Joining me to discuss, Jeanne Meserve, Executive Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, Alexandria Harris, President of the Andrew Goodman Foundation, and Joel Grewe, Executive Director of HSLDA Action and Generation Joshua. Thank you all for joining me. You all represent different organizations and different voting blocks. I think it would be helpful to get a sense of where each one of you is coming from. Jeanne, tell us about the National Domestic Workers Alliance. What is it? Who does it represent?
We work with the 2.2 million women, mostly women and majority women of color, who work inside of our homes, providing caregiving and cleaning services as nannies, house cleaners, and home care workers. It's the work that makes all other work possible, very important, always been essential, and yet it is severely undervalued, and the conditions are quite challenging. Low wages, long hours, unpredictable hours, no job security, no access to benefits or a safety net. And our civic engagement involves mobilizing domestic workers and also other women of color who are working in the low-wage economy to participate in our electoral politics and in our democracy, not just during elections, but year-round.
I imagine that this is a diverse group. Is there one particular issue that motivates them and mobilizes them?
It's a very diverse group. It is every nationality, ethnicity, religion, culture you can imagine represented in our workforce. And right now we have an incredible moment in terms of our policy priorities around investing in our care economy. Investing in the accessibility of childcare, paid family and medical leave, and home care for the growing aging population and people with disabilities, which also allows us to invest in caregiving jobs, making them living wage jobs with benefits and real economic security. That is a big priority of ours right now.
Joel, HSLDA Action and Generation Joshua are both rooted in Christian biblical values. How do those translate into teaching young people about civic engagement and about responsibility?
Well, a couple different ways. First of all, if you're working with teaching people to engage in that, the first thing you have to understand is how the process works, right? Because if you don't understand how the process works, you can't effectively engage it. A lack of understanding functions as a limiter for anyone. So one of the first things we do, both as HSLDA Action, representing the millions of homeschoolers in America, which kind of was everyone, at least a few months ago, we had this moment where everybody got to play with homeschooling and to see how that worked. And we got really busy really fast. But also for the young people that come through that, we equip them in how their government works. And the reason we do that, and frankly, we work with people from all walks of faith, cultures, and backgrounds, all ethnicities, and a wide variety of political spectrums, more than you might expect. But one of the things that we do for all of them is try to equip them in how their process works and how to keep it something that they can customize, because the strength of homeschooling actually exists within the sheer diversity that can exist within it. And the more regulation that comes into that, the harder that is. So we teach them how that works, how to engage it, and how to maintain its unique freedom that it holds.
Joel, I think of Christians as being a highly motivated voting bloc.
Yes.
Has that changed?
No, I would say not. Particularly, I'm going to say my niche works within specifically the homeschool circles, but understand for homeschoolers, in the early 80s, it was illegal in 49 of the 50 states to homeschool. You got your kids taken away and you got thrown in prison. And that happened over and over and over. And so we are, relatively speaking, young in that regards. It's been 40 years since we were being put in prison. Okay, that's a thing. And so we had to learn how that civic activism worked really fast, and to hold that and keep that. And so the people that are in this movement largely either were those people or their direct descendants, and that's about as far removed as we are. So those are pretty well stretched muscles.
So beyond homeschooling, Joel, what are the other key issues that your group centers on?
We work on, well, obviously homeschooling, right? But that is a much bigger thing because that gets into family policy, right? As far as how governments interact with families, there's a huge section that encompasses. Education policy obviously runs into what homeschooling does, right? Every local school board up to the Department of Education. So you get education policy and family policy as the two big intersecting points with what we do.
And abortion?
Sure. As a rule, that's definitely a motivating factor for a lot of them. It doesn't have to be our issue per se, but for a lot of the families, frankly, that runs anathema to how they view life and how they view family. So that is a very strong subgroup within it. It's not required for homeschooling per se, but it's a natural driver.
Alex, you were actually turned away at the polls when you were a college student. I think it was the 2000 election. How has that shaped your work, particularly the work you do with the Andrew Goodman Foundation?
It's very central, and it's been a motivating factor for me to even join the organization. And it's actually been really ironic. So all this time later, I'm leading an organization, and we are really helping young people's voices and votes be a powerful force in our democracy. And it's just been heartbreaking to see the amount of difficulty that young voters in Georgia had to make their voices powerful. So, obviously SB 202 was signed into law, and our students were quite devastated because it criminalized things that our students utilize to get out the vote, including, providing water to people online and all the other things that people experienced, including early voting and, all the limitations. So it's been a motivating factor and quite challenging for me to see.
Jeanne, I'm wondering if your membership as well has been affected by these changes in state voting laws.
Absolutely. If you think about this, the workforce that I work with, and really many women of color who are often labeled as low propensity voters, meaning that they're not consistent voters, we consider them high potential voters because we know that when they have the means, they have the ability to vote, they absolutely will. And when we engage with them, when we support them to participate in our democratic process, they show up, and they show up in numbers, and they stand in line, and they stand in line for hours. And what has happened with some of these laws, like the ones that Alex mentioned, is that a lot of the mechanisms that actually make it possible for people who want to vote and participate and have their voices heard just makes it so much more difficult than it already is if you are a low-wage worker who needs childcare in order to get to the polls, or doesn't have a paid day off and has to work on a Tuesday and risks losing their job if they're stuck in a line for a long time. So all of these are contributing factors. If we want a healthy democracy, we have to make it as easy as possible for people like the people that I work with.
Joel, what about HSLDA? Has it taken a position on these state voting modifications that are still moving in many states?
Not the state laws. We've talked about the federal one because we deal with federal issues. There's state homeschool associations in almost every state. Some states have more than one.
Well, where are you on the federal laws? Let's talk HR1.
HR1, SR1, SB1, we stand opposed to those for a variety of reasons. One of them is, frankly, an attack on free speech that it carries forward. I honestly find the opposition to that bill, frankly, bipartisan, and the support of it, frankly, partisan. And I would concur with Manchin on his assessment of that.
Before I get reaction to that, and I can see on the screen, I'm going to get some.
Sure you will, yes.
Explain how you believe this impacts free speech.
There's a slew of different things that this bill does. One of which is automatic registration for voting, whether you are even a citizen of our country or not, and eligible to vote. It nationalizes the registration system for voting in a variety of different ways that frankly takes it away from the states that are responsible for that. But on our end, that's not homeschoolers' issue with that. One of the things that it does is it puts a significant limiter on the ability of associations like mine and the rest of our panelists to be able to speak freely on the issues they care about. Okay, and those, frankly, are an assault on the First Amendment, and that's a big deal.
Alex, you want to react?
Sorry, I'm making a lot of faces. I love the First Amendment. I don't understand the leap between the two. Automatic registration, I think, is fantastic. Like, for example, I recently moved to New Jersey and we got automatic vote by mail ballots, and it was so convenient. So registering automatic, we know the countries do this, and I don't see how it's any kind of attack on the First Amendment. We right now, because of COVID, we experienced such an attack on youth voting from voter ID restrictions and all these other things.
But Alex, if I could just interject, didn't we see a big surge in youth voting in 2020? Wasn't it higher than it's ever been before?
Yes, because they were very motivated, but it was a huge challenge. So I remember when we were gearing up in April and May, there was a real question about whether we would have a high turnout or any turnout with youth voting, because students were being displaced. They're experiencing all types of issues and a lot of pushback and restriction, but students pushed through all of those obstacles and were extremely successful, as you pointed out, and we're really proud about that. It just goes to show how much they wanted to be counted.
Or that the laws that weren't that big an obstacle.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's one perspective, but when we were talking to students, for example, let me tell you about one of our students. She had a huge health problem, and she attempted in Wisconsin to vote by mail. Somehow her application got lost in the mail. Now, she was a cancer survivor, and it was a huge risk to her health, but she stood online because she cared that much and wanted to be counted. But that was life and death that she risked, and so I do think that's a huge obstacle.
Ai-jen Poo, I think that you also wanted to respond on the HR1 issue. Chime right in.
I just really wanted to say that none of the federal bills automatically register non-citizens. So that's just a falsehood. Wanted to make sure to clarify that. And I did want to really understand more about Joel's perspective when it comes to the connection between free speech, because I'm also very much committed to free speech and the First Amendment, and the connection between that and the mechanisms to strengthen access to voting.
Joel?
I would love to respond to that, actually. So a couple of things. In the last election, for example, I work with young people, I think like Alex does, largely. I work with high school and college age students. And one of the young men I worked with, he is currently serving in our armed forces now. He got his mail-in ballot, right? Like most of us did. He just got 3, okay? From 3 different places, all of which had him listed on the ballot rolls, and frankly, had no mechanism or reason for them to know that he could have voted 3 times. He didn't, right? But that happened over and over and over. And I think the reason that speaks to the accountability and trust that comes to our electoral process, right? If the citizens cannot trust their election process to be true and valid, it weakens the validity of governance for America. Because what is voting? Really, it's giving a bit of your sovereignty to the government to then enforce on everyone, right? Like that gives power. And if you can't trust that, it weakens that. But I want to go back to Ai-jen Poo's question on First Amendment, because I think that's a good question that frankly needs to be answered. HR1 has a specific provision that quotes, that criminalizes, quote, interfering, hindering, or preventing anyone from registering to vote. But the way it's worded is so broad that you can't challenge any of that. So if you have someone who is not eligible to vote, be it a felon who's not permitted to in the state, be it someone who's not a citizen, et cetera, HR1, S1 as it is, would prevent that sort of challenge coming, which degrades trust of people saying, this is our United States of America that we are investing authority and power into to govern us. No, it's actually us and others, and that becomes a breakdown of faith in our system. And faith in institutions in our country is at an all-time low. This weakens that, for one. Furthermore, beyond that, HR1 limits the ability of anyone to object to the law by nature of the law itself unless you're filing in the District of Columbia. You can't challenge it in any of the other federal circuits. You can't challenge it in any of the states. They said, actually, the only place you can challenge this law is in the District of Columbia. Well, that also doesn't seem right, because this law definitely reaches beyond the borders of the District of Columbia. There's a couple different things that actually have a very chilling effect on speech and representative democracy that are baked into this thing.
Alex and Jeanne, I want to give you a quick chance to respond before we move on. Anything to say in response?
I mean, I didn't hear any First Amendment. Now I'm a lawyer. I didn't hear anything in there that would begin to implicate the First Amendment in what you just said. But what I think is interesting, it's almost the exact opposite of what's happening in Georgia. So SB 202 allows all frivolous challenges to the validity of people's votes. And it's exactly what you're saying, but in the opposite, because it holds up our system. It decreases people's faith in our system. Because if I go to vote and then there are all these frivolous challenges to my vote, then I have no faith in our system. So that's why I'm baffled by this partisan support or challenges to these laws. I think we should all be in support of the For the People Act, because it is really restoring our faith. And so I'm always shocked when I hear that people don't support these laws.
Jeanne, anything to weigh in quickly?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Not to pick up on that one.
Well, I agree with what Alex said.
Alex and Joel, you both work with young people. And I'm wondering what levers work. What actually gets results for you? Is peer pressure, for instance, very useful when you're trying to motivate them to vote? Alex, why don't you go first?
Absolutely. So the way that the Andrew Goodman Foundation is set up, we work with ambassadors. And so they're kind of our gateway to the rest of the campus. And so these ambassadors use social media, they use all different tactics to get their peers really excited about getting registered. And then we use them as kind of our mouthpiece on campus to share information, to make sure that people are aware of deadlines, to make sure that people know about laws. And in the past election, we used our students to inform other students about their ballots being rejected and giving them a chance to cure their ballots. So we made it cool to vote, and that was like positive peer pressure, and I'm really proud of it.
Joel, tell me about what tactics you're using to try and motivate them.
So we do a couple things. First of all, we find that relationships are one of the most powerful things to get someone to go vote, right? The random piece of mail that comes to your house basically becomes something for your birdcage, right? And we all get far too much of it. If I could print off the stuff that I get on Facebook, it'd be the same thing, right? So what we instead do is we say, hey, we try and actually go knock on their door in person. We try and talk to them in person. Frankly, social media, although is very much effective, but generally speaking, people want to be asked, and they want to be asked in a personal way. Jeanne, if someone knocks on your door that you know and says, hey, I want to make sure you go vote, that will leave a mark, particularly if that person can knock on their door and say, hey, I'm not actually even old enough to vote yet. I really care about the future of our country. This is the only way I can be involved is by reminding you to go vote. That sticks, and it sticks really well.
So Joel, in this world, one always hears about social media and its incredible power, but what you seem to be saying is the old-fashioned technique of knocking on doors actually has an impact.
It was remarkably effective in what we've been doing for years, because frankly, when we do the measurements, we can track turnout rates from social media to phones to mail to in-person contact. And that in-person contact is by far the single most effective motivator for a particular person. You might need 49 exposures on social media to have the same effect as one knock if you actually talk to the person, okay? And because frankly, we live in a world that is incredibly connected and honestly wildly isolated at the same time. You only see a particular group that is yours. You may not see this other person. It's like, there's a real person wanting to talk to me that can answer questions real time, that can have that conversation. That is powerful. And it is incredibly unique in our culture now.
I'm kind of, go ahead, Alex, did you want to?
I just wanted to add something that I think is an interesting nuance. COVID. So we used to always knock on doors and table and go into people's classes. We couldn't do that last year. So it completely revolutionized how we were reaching people. And Joel's right, that personal connection is really important. So we started doing couch parties. People would text message their friends and you could ask a human a question. So he's right about that connection, but we use digital organizing in ways that we never did before and will always do in the future. And I think that we're seeing a revolution in how people are, kind of elevating those old school ways of knocking on doors because, global pandemic.
Jen, I have to believe that you're facing some different challenges because of the diversity of the membership in your organization. You're probably dealing with language issues, cultural issues. Maybe not everybody uses social media. Talk to me a little bit about those challenges and the challenge that some of your members are undocumented and can't vote. How do they get their voices heard?
Yes, so we actually have people of all statuses, lots of US citizens, lots of green card holders, and also some undocumented immigrants. And the way that they get their voices heard is by being a part of a community that is advocating together and organizing together. And it's powerful. And especially for workers who work in isolation, right, behind closed doors and private homes across the country, to be able to break out of that isolation and find and build community is really quite transformative for this workforce. And we do a lot of the same tactics that Alex and Joel just talked about. We do a lot of door knocking and engaging people about why it's important, especially as we've figured out safer ways to do that. Initially in the pandemic, we pivoted to phones because we really do believe, in addition to social media, we have to do direct voter contact however we can do it. And in the pandemic, we actually started with calling voters about just how they're doing and doing what we called care wellness checks, where we just called people and didn't talk about voting at all for several months, just seeing how they're doing, how they're faring, what they're struggling with. And a lot of what they were struggling with was care and caregiving challenges, which was exactly why that issue became such a powerful, motivating issue for people to engage, despite the fact that there was a pandemic and voter suppression and threats of violence at the polls. There were so many different reasons for why people would choose to not vote last year. And instead, I think they really realized just how important their voice is, especially to help bring our country out of crisis.
So each of you is trying to mobilize your block of voters, the things who are concerned, the people who are concerned about the same issues you are. What about all the other voters who may not be wedded to these particular issues? How do we bring them into the system? How do we get them involved in voting? I throw that out to all of you because I just don't have any idea what you're going to say. Who wants to go first?
Go ahead, please. Go ahead, Alex.
I was just going to say, we actually are not issue-based, although people would probably disagree.
well, given the name of your organization, I assumed that social justice was perhaps at the top of the agenda.
It's a part of it, but for sure, because of who we are and our legacy, we definitely are not agnostic. But making it's really difficult. One thing that we've had some schools say, hey, we don't like what you're doing around for the people or anything else, so please stop doing that. Just get people out to vote, register people to vote, and make sure that you're making it as open to everyone as possible. And I will say that has been a big challenge for us, just by virtue of what you pointed out, that it can kind of turn people off. We try to make everything as open as possible. For example, at the end of the month on June 25th and June 26th, we're having a huge summit that's open to any student where we do training and we help them create action plans and get out the rest of their classmates to mobilize them to vote. And so by keeping things open, I think that allows more people to come in the door who wouldn't normally come in because of our name and our legacy.
Joel, what were your quick thoughts on this, on how to draw on the people who aren't necessarily invested in your issue?
Sure. Well, I think for what we do, particularly for Generation Joshua, we start by educating them as humans and citizens. then we talk about issues. But we talk about them as equipping them to be effective for whatever issue they're passionate about. I don't care what it is. And we have people that go into all sorts of political spectrums, all sorts of partisan positions, and from all sorts of different ideas that come out of our education being well-grounded. And that creates a platform for kind of the marketplace of ideas where all ideas can come and be heard. And it's frankly a place where anyone is welcome. That does a lot. Because then it doesn't really matter what you think walking in the door. We want to hear from you. We want to talk to you. We want to encourage and equip you to be effective. And then we can talk about the policy stuff too, but we don't start there. Otherwise, I think Alex is right. I think it becomes, some people will be put off by that. And so we try and have a very broad welcome mat at the front for anyone who wants to come in.
Jeanne, what would you say to those people out there who kind of shrug at the idea of voting?
I would say that democracies are living, breathing things, and it's we, the people, who breathe life into them. And if we don't participate, they die. And the more we participate, the more they work for more of us. And if what we want is a healthy, multiracial democracy with a place of dignity and belonging and opportunity for everyone, we are all going to have to engage, because that is a very big project, a very big project. And as my friend Heather McGee once said, this country is the greatest experiment in democracy in the world, which means it's also an all hands on deck situation.
Jeanne Pooh, Alexandra Harris, Joel Grewe, thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to the audience for joining us as well. Our next episode, Disinformation Democracy, is coming up on July 29th. You can register at reimaginingdemocracy.org, and you can continue the conversation about these very important issues on social media. Use the hashtag #DemocracyReimagined. I'm Jeanne Meserve. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.